All right. I'd like to welcome everyone today to the Canadian Alliance Technical and Trading Assistance Program by Name List and Coordinated Access webinar series. Today we will be talking about matching and referral. And I am going to tell you a little bit about myself. I am obviously not Wally Check. You will notice that his picture is there. I am Jody Yurkowski-Pace. My position is as Coordinated Access Trainer with the Training and Technical Assistance Program of the Canadian Alliance, and I'll be your host today. I want to start off this webinar just by telling you or reminding you a little bit about the Canadian Alliance. There are sort of 4 divisions of the Canadian Alliance and the work we are doing across Canada. The first most people know about is the National Conference on Ending Homelessness, which is held in November every year. The last one most recently was held in Edmonton, and the upcoming 2020 conference will be held in Toronto. Just a reminder also that 2 days prior to the conference this year will also be a international symposium on Housing First, which will be hosted as well in Toronto. So you'll want to find out more information about that. It will be forthcoming. The Canadian Alliance also has Built for Zero Canada, which, as the sign here says, it's an ambitious national change effort, leading communities across the country to address chronic and veteran homelessness. And Ian DeYoung, who will be hosting our webinar today, or who will be the guest on our webinar today, has had a lot of contact with the Built for Zero Canada program. The other part of Canadian Alliance is the Training and Technical Assistance Program, of which I am a staff member, and Wally Check is the director of that program. Many of you know Wally Check. And the fourth part of the Canadian Alliance is the allied networks that are part of that, the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness, the Canadian Network for Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness, the Women's Network, the Ontario Alliance to End Homelessness, to name a few. The mission of the Canadian Alliance is to lead a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. And that is something that can't be done without all of you. And so I want to thank you for being here today to be a part of that. I also need to recognize that this today and all of the work that we are doing with Coordinated Access is in part funded by the federal government through the our Community Capacity and Innovation Funding Stream of Reaching Home. And we are very grateful for that. The day today is going to be a webinar. The purpose of the webinar is to provide information, ideas, and best practices as opposed to our community of practice calls. It's going to be an hour long. Ian will provide information and a presentation with slides, and at the end, if time permits, there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions to him. I recommend that you do that through the chat option, and I can either read out your questions if you form them that way, or I can unmute you and you can ask the question of Ian yourself. And just a reminder that the webinar will be recorded and that it will be available on the TTA website following this presentation. At this point, I am going to stop sharing my slides and I'm going to hand over the presentation to Ian DeYoung, who is going to speak to you about matching and referral. Most or all of you already know who Ian is. He's the founder of WordCode. He's well known across Canada and across the world for the work that he's doing on homelessness, prevention, best practices, Housing First, and the development of coordinated access and by name lists. He is the author of the book on ending homelessness, and I want to thank him for being here today.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to focus today on the matching and referral part of coordinated access. And to do that, I'm going to run you through a series of slides. These slides are are not going to take us kind of backwards in terms of the other webinars that I've completed on this subject. So if you haven't been involved in previous webinars, I would encourage you to go to the Canadian Alliance website and look at the webinar that we did on access points. We did one on assessment referral, and we did one on prioritization. And so there's a natural progression and sequence of the information that we are providing so that communities are aware of all the different steps that go into having a high functioning coordinated access approach that should result in both prioritization of people within your community that are in great need of housing, that should allow for you to have a process in place that allows for robust assessment and understanding of information of needs, and where you have various access points where people can become engaged in the coordinated access process. As was mentioned in the wonderful introduction that was provided, there will be time for Q&A. I would encourage you to use the chat box function. I will not be looking at the chat box function as I'm going through the slides, but when I get to the conclusion of the slides, we can look at all the questions that are in the chat box and read them out and make sure that everybody is aware of the question, and I'll provide the best possible responses that I can, assuming that I have an answer or insight into the specific question that is asked. So let's get into this by first looking at the purpose of matching and referral. So to understand matching and referral, I start by saying it's a process and an action. So process, it is the approach that you are actually going to use to get an individual or family that has actually been prioritized as per your community's prioritization methods, actually connected, and that's the action part, to an open spot, either on a caseload or in a vacant unit. So you're going to hear me make distinctions today and provide more commentary on both caseload or vacant units. So in the caseload approach, what we're really talking about is usually scattered site approaches to housing first delivery, where we don't necessarily have the unit identified that the individual or family is going to move in, but we know that there is a spot on the caseload, and by attaching the individual or family to the caseload, the caseworker will have the responsibility, sometimes in partnership with other organizations, of finding and securing a unit and providing support. On the vacant unit side, we are talking more about site-based approaches, often congregate living facilities, where we know that an actual apartment unit is available, and we're going to match the individual or family to that apartment unit. All the matches and referrals that are made in coordinated access come from your community's priority list. It also, though, requires you to know all of the eligibility requirements of any potential spot that's open on a caseload or vacant unit, so that we're matching not only who is the top priority, but we're matching the person or family that is the top priority and meets the eligibility requirements of that specific program. So for example, if you had a women's specific housing first program, to be eligible for that, you'd have to identify as a woman, in which case we need to make sure that we are only matching people who identify as women to that specific vacancy. Or if you had, let's say, a supportive housing building that requires people to have a mental health diagnoses and perhaps a serious and persistent mental illness to qualify for the housing, well, that would fall under eligibility criteria. So you'd only be looking at those individuals or members of families that meet the eligibility criteria before making the match. When it comes to matchmaking, we can follow a process where we start by looking at who are the persons on the priority list. And there may be 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or 20. Remember from previous webinars, we're trying to keep that priority list smaller rather than larger, and that the priority list is a subset of your coordinated access list, which is a subset of your by name list. So if we think of the by name list as being the entire universe of everybody that you know by name and is consented to service. The coordinated access list are those who remain active and are in the process of becoming paper ready. By the time that individual or family is on the priority list, they match your community's priorities that you've established, and they are paper ready. So we have these people on the priority list, and then we know that an open spot is available on a caseload or vacancy. And so we have to have a mechanism, and we'll get into this a little bit further, for knowing that that spot is available. We then filter our priority list to see who meets the eligibility criteria for that specific vacant spot. So as I was saying just a few moments ago, if it was a women's only program, you'd be filtering your list to be looking at those people who are on the priority list who identify as women. Then, depending upon the approach that you're using for prioritization, you may want to have a case conference regarding all eligible candidates and get into conversation relative to the strengths of each person or family and their match, at least theoretically, to that available spot in a caseload or into a vacant unit. We then get to a place where we offer that spot on the caseload or the vacancy to the individual or family. And we don't want to lose sight of the fact that following that, there is still consumer choice. So that individual or family still has to say, yes, I would like that spot or vacancy, or no, I do not want that spot or vacancy. I want to be really clear in the consumer choice process that there's nothing punitive that's part of your matching and referral policies or approach that is going to put that individual or family into a place where they're disadvantaged in future open spots or vacancies. So it's a non-punitive approach. But assuming that the individual or family did decide that they wanted that spot, the process actually has to go forward to find the unit and then move in, or if it's a vacant unit, then the likelihood of then moving in quicker happens. And from the position where they move in, and only at the position where they move in, do we remove the individual from our lists. But that can also result in the creation of a new list, which is your housed person list. So the list of all the individuals and families that have been housed through coordinated access in your community. So how do we go about getting confirmation of availability on a caseload or a vacancy in housing? So this confirmation process has to happen prior to making an offer to be on the caseload or to move into the vacant program. So in doing that prior, the system, the coordinated access system, has to confirm that the spot or vacancy can be imminently filled. And the way that we do this is creating an input or feedback loop to identify and confirm the spots and vacancies. And the onus in most communities goes onto the case management program or onto the provider of housing to indicate that the spot is available and that it can be occupied by an individual or family on the priority list. And the reason why we want there to be that feedback loop is because there can be issues of short staffing, or let's say a unit is in need of repair and can't be immediately occupied. So on paper, it might look like there's a spot on a caseload or a vacant unit, but operationally that may not be the case. So to get a sense of what this can look like, communities may say that the case management programs or the supportive housing provider needs to provide an email to the coordinated access manager or leader or whoever is kind of controlling those mechanisms within your system to indicate that they have a spot available and that it can be occupied. So that's one approach. Another approach that's used in some communities is a weekly case conference meeting that brings together all the different case management programs and all the different, let's say, supportive housing programs that might have vacancies. And at the start of that meeting, they indicate how many vacancies or open spots they're looking to fill. So there's different ways that you can get to that place of confirmation, but we need to make sure that we have confirmation prior to making a match. It is not in the best interest of the individuals or families that we're serving to make a match without knowing that they can actually get the resource at the other end. In informing participants in the match and reinforcing consumer choice, the way that this is going to work will be informed in part by which prioritization method your community has chosen. So in descending acuity and frequent service users, we usually get to an approach where we have one candidate, one individual or one family that we want to make the offer to. In the universal system management approach, we may have a pool of candidates that we could make the offer to. And regardless of which approach to prioritization that you take, the second part of this is who is going to make the offer. So is it going to be that the coordinated access, we'll call them coordinator, it gets in touch with a shelter where the person or the family is staying and asks the shelter worker to inform the individual or family that there's an open spot on a caseload or a vacancy? Or do we want to filter that information out to a street outreach worker? Or if we are collecting the phone numbers of individuals and families who are homeless and assuming that they have a phone and they have minutes, is the coordinated access system going to try and connect with them directly? Do we have housing navigators in our community who might be mobile, who can go around and make these offers? But you do have to figure out the mechanism of how will this information be known? And what I would strongly urge you not to do is have an open public list that individuals who experience homelessness kind of search for their name and whether or not they've been selected. And the reason why I would advise against that is because your prioritization approach is going to mean that there can be a state of flux in terms of where people are at in the priority sequence. We don't want to give the people the illusion that they're at the top of a list today, only for them to find out tomorrow that they're sixth on the list. So we only want that communication to happen if and only if we know that that spot or that vacancy is available and that spot or vacancy can be filled and that the individual or family could move in or take access of the unit if it's a place-based environment imminently, or on the caseload side that we can get them connected to the case manager to start the process of locating housing. Further to this, we want to make sure that we do not lose sight of choice. So in creating choice, we want people to have an active voice. And we start to change the language that might be used in an organization or community to say, we don't do housing placements, we provide housing choices. In doing that, if we have a potential match to a case management program or to a vacant unit in a building, we want that individual or family to know what type of case management services will they be receiving? What is the nature of the program requirements, if there are any? What is going to be expected of them by way of rent payment? How is that particular housing going to impact their lifestyle? Where in the community, especially in medium to large size cities, where in the community is the possibility of the vacant unit in the event of place-based, so that they can actually say, from an informed perspective, yes, I want this, or no, I don't want this. And if they go the second route and say that they don't want a particular open spot or they don't want a particular vacancy, we want to make sure that they remain on the priority list and that they can be considered a candidate for future open spots or vacancies. So there's no process that we want to put in place in communities that say things like, you get 2 offers or 3 offers, and if you don't select any of those offers, you automatically go to the bottom of the list. If they're a priority, then they remain a priority until they actually secure housing. So there are differences between matching to a caseload and matching to a vacancy. And we'll start with matching to a caseload. As I was saying previously, this often relates to scattered site housing. So renting units in existing apartment buildings or houses throughout your entire community. So these are not houses or buildings that are specific for your program. We're talking about individuals or families that would move into a building where their next door neighbor is very likely not a program participant and receiving any services. In the match to caseload, it is the responsibility of that particular caseworker or their team or existing partnerships they have to actually find a vacancy that meets the participant's needs. Now, in terms of meeting the participant's needs, there is another level of instruction that goes from the program participant to the caseworker that outlines what those preferences are, and encourage you or your community to develop a process by which that individual or family can be really clear on what are the must-haves in their housing versus what are the nice-to-haves in their housing, or what are the things that they absolutely cannot have in their housing, so that we can start to narrow our search. Now, I know that some, if not many, if not all of you on this webinar today would come back and say there is not enough affordable housing in your community. And I would say almost all, if not all of you, are going to be accurate in that assessment. That said, if it is your responsibility of a particular program to find housing for an individual, what we don't want to have happen is to have individuals or families assigned to a caseload and then have there be months and months of lag time where the person or the family is still homeless but on a caseload, but they haven't actually moved into housing, because in that period of time, that individual or family is still considered a priority, but isn't actually moving towards housing. So your system can get completely bogged down if you don't have caseworkers or partnerships for your caseworkers that are actually good at identifying housing quickly. There's probably another entire webinar that we could do on strategies to effectively recruit landlords and find vacant units on a regular basis. But I will say, just by way of a blanket statement, if that caseworker is just jumping on like Craigslist or Kijiji every single day and just kind of going through that as their one and only strategy for locating potential vacancies for program participants, they're probably going to find that the number of people on the caseload that are still homeless is growing, and the number of people who are actually being supported in housing goes down. So we need there to be mechanisms for allowing that throughput. We also then need to be sensitive to caseload size, and we do not, as a matter of coordinated access, want to keep adding homeless individuals to a caseload when the existing homeless individuals and families on the caseload are not achieving housing. So we may actually get to a place in coordinated access where we suspend add new people to a caseload, even though on paper it looks like they have spots on a caseload, because the majority of the caseload, or too many people on the caseload, have not secured housing yet. In matching to a vacancy, this often applies to site-based housing options like congregate supportive housing. This is a little bit easier to manage in the coordinated access process because it ultimately comes down to two questions for the program participant, that individual or family being supported. Do they want to live in that particular building? And do they want the supports that come with living in that building? If the answer is yes to both of those, then the match is made. So unlike the match in the caseload that might have some lag time, we tend to see much less lag time when we're matching to a vacancy. That doesn't mean that matching to a vacancy is better than matching to a caseload. It just means that it often happens quicker in the context of coordinated access. So when and how should we use case conferencing in the matching and referral process? So case conferences are part of the match process, especially if you're using descending acuity or frequent service user approaches to prioritization. If the individual or family is identified as a priority, but is repeatedly ineligible for programs that have spots on caseloads or vacancies, that is also often worthy of a case conference. In other words, if all of the options that should be available to people who are homeless are not available to a specific group of individuals or families that are homeless. And those individuals or families are usually, not exclusively, usually households that have a number of complex and co-occurring issues or unique circumstances. Then we should be case conferencing, well, what is going to be the housing solution for that particular individual or family that's not well served through our existing approach. The third instance where case conference can be warranted is when that individual or family is getting stale on the priority list. And what I mean by that is you've identified that this individual or family is a priority in your community, and yet there aren't any housing options that are coming their way. And so we get to a point where, and your community should establish its own rules, where it's maybe 6 months or 9 months or 12 months or 18 months, really will depend on the size of your coordinated access and the size of your community. But if that person or that family is not being selected, we probably should case conference with existing caseloads and housing operators, as well as home service providers, to say, how can we create an option or a match for this individual or family that is not having options for housing presented to them? And then the fourth instance where we might find there to be advantages to having a case conference is when the individual or family has presenting issues such that their needs for supports will likely extend beyond the types of supports that are available just within the site-based housing or through the case management program. And so we want to start with this idea of a wraparound supportive care for that individual or family to hopefully increase the likelihood of success in housing when they move in. In terms of case conferences practices, I strongly encourage you to be in a position where, as a matter of course, you are inviting the individual or family in question to attend the case conference, to be empowered to advocate on their own behalf. I would say, just as a general observation, in too many communities, there are case conferences happening about people without people. So really well-intentioned workers come together to talk about Ian, but never actually asking Ian if he wants to attend and speak on his own behalf. Now, I'm not saying the individual or family has to be at the case conference, but we should be able to demonstrate that an offer was made for them to attend the case conference unless there's really significant extenuating circumstances. These sorts of case conferences that we're talking about in the context of coordinated access are most often organized and chaired by a representative of the coordinated access system. In other words, we're not looking at the sort of case conference that is just about a particular worker in the context of their specific supports for that individual or family. We're taking it to a system level and saying, how do we get the input from across the system to help this individual or family to the best of our ability, using a holistic approach and trying to be as strength-based as possible. That case conference approach may look similar, but I would say is slightly different from the warm handoffs that should occur within the matching and referral part of coordinated access. So in the warm handoff, whether or not you do case conferences is irrelevant. We have to think through, how can we make sure that there is adequate information exchange between the staff that were involved when the person or the family was homeless, the homeless individual or family themselves, and that caseworker or the staff within the supportive housing that will be receiving the individual or family and providing the housing and support. Now, when we get all three entities involved, the homeless service providers, the individual or family, the housing solution entities, all around the table, the information exchange should be factual in nature. It is a bit of a case history, and so the homeless service organization or staff have the ability to say, I've worked with this individual or family from X period of time. Here are some of the presenting issues. Here's the work that we've been able to accomplish relative to those presenting issues. Having the individual or family confirm or add additional information or interject when they think of something perhaps is off kilter in the presentation of their specific case, and have the ability to provide clarification or additional information. And then for the receiving entity to ask questions of clarification. But I want to be really clear that by the time the warm handoff has occurred, this is not, I'll stress, this is not an opportunity for the receiving entity to decide whether or not they want to serve the individual or family. That's already been established. The warm handoff is about receiving information to further allow for robust services and supports for the individual and family. The warm handoff is not an evaluation or judgment of fit. And when we think about when in the process to conduct the warm handoff, we want to, whenever possible, do this prior to move-in. Now, if you can't do it prior to move-in, doing it as soon thereafter as possible, and also doing it in an environment that the individual or family who is homeless feels most comfortable within. But if we do it prior to move-in, it really is the time that everybody has the greatest invested interest in getting that information exchange to happen. If you have the individual or family who's already moved into housing, you could run into circumstances where the homeless service entity essentially says, I'm too busy. They're all yours now. Can't do the warm handoff. But if the individual or family was still homeless, you can get greater buy-in from the homeless service entity to want to participate in that case conference. Similarly, you could have an individual or family that is very eager to engage in the warm handoff meeting while they're still homeless in the relay of information, who might say once they move into housing, well, why do we have to bother doing that? I'm already in housing. So trying to get it further upstream is usually advantageous. In the matching and referral process of coordinated access, it is absolutely critical that there's no secondary screening. It's another way of saying there's no more hoops to jump through for the individual or family to be able to move into housing and, based upon their depth of need, receive the supports that will increase the likelihood of their success in housing. So where this results in changes for some programs and services, and in particular, I'll say some types of supportive housing providers may have a history of doing this, is to say, look, we know that Ian is a priority. We know that Ian meets our eligibility criteria, but we want to meet with Ian first to see if he's a fit. Well, there's no objective way of determining fit when I describe it like that. If you had specific eligibility requirements, we would have already taken care of those upstream. But when you're really saying fit comes down to personality or whether or not I think I like the guy, that's hugely problematic. Second practice that we have to do away with, which again, some existing programs do, is saying, look, we're not going to have staff do this. We're going to have the individual or family meet with other tenants or other program participants. And those other tenants or other program participants are going to decide whether or not they think the person's fit. I mean, I've even seen in places in Canada where some housing providers, especially supportive housing providers, want to give the individual a trial experience of being in housing. So you can stay with us for 3 or 7 days, and then you'll meet with other tenants and they will decide whether or not you're a good fit and you can stay here. That's turning coordinated access into a game of survivor. That is not the intention of making the match. So if there are specific qualities that existing tenants or program participants or staff within the programs want to make sure happens, let's get that articulated on paper. Let's make sure those are objective, and let's make sure that we take care of those in the eligibility process or in the case conferencing process, but not in the actual match process. Because we, as a system of care, delivering matching and referral through coordinated access, need to be assured that once the match is made, there are no steps left to be taken that could exclude the person or family from getting that spot on the caseload or the vacancy. And then we need to update lists after housing is secured. So what does this mean? Well, we need to take people off the by name list, the coordinated access list, or the priority list, and we need to move them onto the housed list. This process of updating the lists ensures that we don't have duplicate offers of service going out to individuals and families. It also will allow us to track throughput and deal with potential issues of inflow and outflow understanding within our community, and also ensures that our system is remaining as nimble as possible in moving forward with those people that do need a housing solution, as opposed to being confused and having people who actually have achieved a housing solution maintaining their spot on the list. And that covers everything that you need to know relative to matching and referral. As I said, there's definitely time for conversation and chat. I would encourage you to use the chat function if you haven't been doing so already for your questions, and we'll make sure those are read aloud and to the best of our ability, answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ian. I don't yet have any questions on the chat, so if you do have any questions, please put that forward now. Ian, one of the things that I've been thinking about as you're speaking, and thank you so much for what you said, has to do around the idea of once the match has been made, that there are no further vetting processes. And I think that one of the things that I speak to communities about is getting all organizations on board to trust that process, because organizations will say, well, but I have something really specific that we offer here that we need to make sure that we're maintaining the credibility of our process. And so I'm going to need to meet with that person individually to decide whether or not that works. And so once we start having those conversations, some people and some organizations feel hesitant to buy into the process. What would you say to them?
Well, I would agree that there's a trust factor here. I'd also say that it kind of elevates what we're doing as service providers, in so much as is what we say we do on paper what we actually do on practice. Because I can say with some certainty that I've encountered communities where they do have this kind of secondary screening process where it's never written down anywhere, what it is, what its purpose is, what the outcomes are, how the grievance process works, those sorts of things. So it becomes this kind of series of unwritten expectations for people. And that's very difficult within a coordinated access system. But if they do have legitimate elements that are necessary for their specific program to be high functioning, then I will say, well, let's turn those into eligibility criteria, and/or let's get a case conference process happening upstream as opposed to reacting once the match has actually been made. So I think that's probably the best ways to go about mitigating that.
Okay, thank you. We've got a comment here from Yulisa de Jager. I hope I said that properly. Just a comment. This is a good time to place some aspects of this discussion in contracts with service providers or MOUs with other systems. The comment is, we're building this in, and your comments today are helping refine that language. So thank you.
And I think that Yulisa is making a really excellent point here around aspects of coordinated access more generally, which if service managers, CBOs, the entity involved in leading the system of care has the ability to put this into contracts with service providers and/or a system, then we can really be in a position where we've actually strengthened the system of care by adding a layer of accountability in a slightly different way to the community partners who deliver the case management and/or vacant spots and supports within units. So I think Elisa's bang on.
Yeah, and building on that, Ian, what you're doing just to the prior conversation or the prior discussion was that is building trust. So, you know, this has all been decided upon in the beginning. Everybody signed off on it. Everybody knows where it's going, and it really does reinforce that trust. Just waiting for any other comments or chat from the attendees. I don't have anything at this point. Oh, Lisa's also said landlord strategies, a landlord strategies webinar would be awesome. Putting something together to outline strategies to work with landlords, I assume. And that's absolutely something that we could look at. Perhaps coordinate with you, Ian.
Sure.
And she's, Yolisa said, especially for landlord liaisons. Absolutely. Working to identify those ways of reaching out, especially to market landlords.
Last call for questions, queries, or cries of anguish related to the matching and referral part of coordinated access.
We've got a quiet bunch today. Come on.
That's all right. I mean, I think because we've been looking at a sequence of webinars and they've been building upon each other, I think that the matching and referral one may be a little bit more obvious than some of the other pieces of the puzzle, because it's really the culmination of everything you've done before, from access points and assessment, and your prioritization strategy really fits into how you ultimately do the matching and referral. But matching and referral tends not to introduce a bunch of new concepts, but rather how do you bring all of those existing concepts to the finish line. So
Ian, you absolutely stole my comment. I was going to say the culmination of everything that we've already talked about. So
there we are.
Yeah, we don't have any other questions. Oh, there is one more comment. It said, would be interesting to see how this is captured and solutions for it in HIFIS.
I agree. That would be interesting.
I think I'm going to stick with your line there, Ian, and agree as well. And the built on that is the further comment is options for how this is operationalized in HIFIS. All right, last call for any other questions for Ian about referral and matching. Doesn't sound like it, Ian. I am going to stop sharing your screen and share my screen back. Thank you very much. Ian, this really does build on everything that you've been speaking to us about up to this point, and I really want to thank you for that. Just a reminder to everyone, upcoming webinars and communities of practice on Tuesday, February 13th, we'll be doing a community of practice presentation from BC, lessons from a community just getting started. So Nelson is going to share where they've been, where they're at, and how it has been for them to really hit the ground running from the very beginning. On February 20th, the Housing First Community of Practice is going to be speaking about community and social integration, and the presenter for that is to be determined at this point yet. And on March 5th, there is going to be a webinar about data and improvement. So those are upcoming webinars and community practice calls. You can get more information about that at the Training and Technical Assistance website, which is listed below here. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending. Again, as always, if you have any comments, questions, anything that comes up after the fact, please do send an email. You can send it to Wally at caeh.ca, or to Jody, Jody, at caeh.ca. And thank you again for attending. And thank you again to Ian for your presentation and sharing your knowledge and expertise in this area. This webinar will be posted, as all webinars are, on the TTA website, probably within the next few hours. So do check back tomorrow if you want to share it with your colleagues. If you have this information that you want to pass on to anyone else that you're working with, please do so. Thank you. And I want to say, oh, we have one more chat. Just 1 second. I'm going to look. Oh, Linda has pointed out, Linda from Nelson has pointed out that it is Thursday, February 13th, that they are going to be doing their Community of Practice webinar. And I do want to thank you for that, Linda. So thank you everybody for your participation today, and I wish you all the best. If there are no other questions, then we are going to end the webinar today.
Bye now.
Bye.